You stand in the searing, unforgiving heat of the Mesopotamian plain, staring at an expanse of nothingness that stubbornly refuses to transform itself into civilization. Around you, dozens of laborers trudge across the dry soil, clutching woven baskets filled with muddy clay, their faces glazed with sweat and a perpetual look of existential exhaustion. Welcome to the birth of the city of Ur, the latest in a line of ill advised ventures in mankind's relentless quest to place bricks on the top of other bricks until something meaningful supposedly emerges. You shade your eyes against the relentless glare of the sun, an indifferent deity that radiates boredom more intensely than warmth. The horizon stretches infinitely, blurred by waves of shimmering heat, interrupted only occasionally by dusty gusts of wind. To the casual observer, this place is indistinguishable from the rest of the sprawling Mesopotamian wasteland. But to the persistent, unimaginably stubborn group of Sumerians sweating next to you, this spot is destined to become a glorious city. You harbor your doubts. Watch your step, a foreman barks, though you're uncertain whether his words are directed at you or at the struggling workers who shuffle around, desperately trying not to drop bricks or collapse from heat stroke. Either way, caution is wise. Bricks litter the ground in haphazard piles, ready to twist ankles or spark existential despair in anyone foolish enough to look closely. These bricks, however, are no ordinary construction materials. They are marvelously, mind numbingly tedious creations made painstakingly from sun baked mud and bits of straw, meticulously mixed together in the optimistic belief that something durable could come from literal dirt and grass. Nearby, several men kneel beside a fresh pit of clay. Their hands are caked with sticky mud as they rhythmically press the clay into rectangular wooden molds. You consider this process with the ironic detachment of someone who has seen civilizations rise and fall, a highly overrated experience, you decide. The workers are silent, except for occasional grunts or muttered curses against the relentless sun. One particularly disheartened looking youth turns his face skyward, perhaps praying silently for shade or death, whichever might prove quicker. Why choose this desolate spot of all places? Well, historically speaking, and history, you note with grim amusement, rarely fails to disappoint. There weren't exactly options. The Euphrates River, capricious and moody, flowed nearby just reliably enough to suggest life might be possible. The fertility of its banks seduced the settlers into believing that wheat might grow, barley might flourish, and that this unpromising collection of mud huts and dust might one day turn into something resembling civilization. A beautiful dream, you concede, but like all beautiful dreams in history, almost certain to end in despair, decay, or at least catastrophic disappointment. Still, humans are nothing if not endlessly hopeful, or perhaps endlessly deluded. You ponder this question while sidestepping another precarious stack of sun dried bricks. The laborers, lacking both irony and the luxury of reflective detachment, proceed with their toil. Each brick represents a tiny act of faith, faith in permanence, in prosperity, and in the eventual respectability of their backbreaking labor. It's oddly moving, though mostly in a depressing way. From your viewpoint, these first walls rising from the ground hardly look sturdy enough to withstand a strong breeze, let alone invasions, floods, or divine wrath. But then again, nobody expects perfection from the first attempt. The walls are uneven, leaning at strange angles, testament to both inexperience and desperation. The workers periodically pause to assess their work with expressions ranging from mild dissatisfaction to outright despair. The more optimistic among them nod bravely, forcing themselves to see strength and security in what is obviously just mud stacked awkwardly upon mud. Time passes at a pace that might generously be described as glacial if glaciers could exist under such punishing heat. The process is painstaking. Each new layer of bricks is carefully placed upon the last, creating something vaguely resembling a wall. Every few hours, workers take short breaks to sip lukewarm water from goatskin bags. The warm, sandy liquid does little to alleviate their misery, but it offers a brief illusion of relief. As evening approaches, the workers begin to retreat to makeshift shelters that provide minimal shade, but maximal disappointment. You, however, remain, compelled by some morbid fascination. You linger in the twilight to witness the changing colors as the sun lowers itself indifferently beneath the horizon. The fading light casts the emerging walls into sharp relief, giving them a shadowy solidity they fail to possess during the day. In these fleeting moments of dusk, you imagine you can almost see the ghostly outline of the grand city that these exhausted dreamers so desperately want to create. But the romantic vision quickly dissipates. Darkness reveals that the walls are as unstable and misshapen as ever, the work of weary hands guided by stubborn hearts. You wonder cynically if future generations will ever understand the sheer volume of sweat, disappointment, and general annoyance required to build something as ambitious as civilization from nothing more than baked mud and stubbornness. Night deepens, blanketing the half built settlement in merciful darkness. The sounds of exhausted laborers fade into silence, punctuated only by occasional groans or snores. You are left alone with the walls, or at least the crude outlines that generously qualify as walls, contemplating how many thousands of similar mud bricks will have to be laid before anyone can claim that has truly risen. And yet, despite your best attempts at detached cynicism, there is something quietly impressive about this relentless stubbornness. Humans, you reflect, never seem to tire of building things destined eventually to crumble back into the earth from which they were so arduously extracted. There is a certain grim nobility in such futility. The moon rises slowly above the horizon, pale and indifferent, illuminating the work of the first day in ghostly silver. This celestial observer seems unimpressed by the accomplishments of mere mortals, yet it continues to watch patiently, much like yourself, as civilizations endlessly come and go. Settling down onto a low wall, you prepare yourself for a long night. You think of all the magnificent cities of the future, places renowned for their grandeur and complexity, and realize with bittersweet amusement that they too will one day crumble to dust exactly like these primitive bricks. But for now, you decide simply to observe, to bear witness to the quiet persistence of humanity, stubbornly building itself up again and again from the same eternal sand, clay, and sweat. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again, and the relentless, foolishly optimistic work will continue. Is slowly being born, and you, unfortunate soul that you are, have chosen to watch its weary birth from the very beginning. You sigh deeply, preparing for more sun, more sweat, and more existential frustration. Such, you conclude grimly, is the tedious but oddly reassuring rhythm of history. You awaken to another dawn, greeted by the suffocating warmth of the Mesopotamian sun that has returned, seemingly with increased enthusiasm, to torment those foolish enough to linger outdoors. Today, however, the laborers around you seem less focused on their crude walls of mud bricks and more intent on beginning something even more ambitious, grandiose, and frankly, ill advised, the foundations of what will one day be the great ziggurat of Ur. A ziggurat, a structure so excessive that it seems specifically designed to exhaust even divine patience, looms large in the imagination of the Sumerians. It is to be dedicated to Nana, the moon god, who you suspect has more important concerns than the architectural aspirations of sweaty, dust covered humans. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, these people have convinced themselves that stacking thousands upon thousands of bricks in orderly layers toward the sky will somehow capture divine favor. The foreman, a weary and cynical man named Ashman, begins the day by shouting orders at his equally weary workers. His commands carry the tone of someone who knows the project is both necessary and absurdly pointless, a fact apparent to anyone who looks closely at the plans sketched hastily on cracked clay tablets. These tablets, as dull as the expressions of those forced to follow their instructions, bear precise but confusing instructions about dimensions and sacred symbolism, suggesting that the gods apparently have oddly specific tastes in architecture. You watch the early hours of construction unfold with an ironic detachment born from the privilege of knowing exactly how this endeavor will turn out. Badly. The first problem is logistics. Thousands of bricks must be moved into position, yet there are neither carts nor wheels, simply rows of workers trudging back and forth, each step fueled not by devotion, but by desperation or obligation. The second, equally daunting issue is morale. Already battered by yesterday's pointless labor, today's workforce appears determined to maintain an air of collective misery, punctuated by periodic groans and mumbled curses directed vaguely at the heavens. But construction continues anyway. Gradually, layer by painstaking layer, the foundation begins to take shape. By noon, what began as an inconspicuous pile of mud transforms into an impressively large pile of mud, a development the Sumerian priests celebrate with prayers, chants, and solemn invocations, all of which you suspect are entirely lost on Nana, who surely has better things to ponder. Eshmun walks past, muttering something cynical about how building higher structures has never seemed to improve human lives significantly, only making them visible targets for divine displeasure. You silently nod, appreciating the depth of his existential gloom. Around you, the laborers take a short rest, seeking shelter beneath flimsy reed canopies that fail spectacularly to provide actual shade, but at least create the illusion of protection from the relentless heat. It is during this respite that the priests appear, stern faced and humorless, leading a procession toward the nascent ziggurat. Their leader, a grim man named Namu, holds a clay bowl filled with grain and pours it solemnly onto the ground as an offering to the gods. Judging by the workers' hungry gazes, you deduce that many would prefer that grain found its way into their stomachs rather than the indifferent soil. Yet nobody voices this objection. Such practical observations, apparently, are best left unspoken. As the afternoon sun blazes mercilessly overhead, the priests continue their rituals, ignoring the increasingly obvious boredom of their divine audience. For centuries, humans have believed that gods prefer complicated ceremonies over practical solutions. You wonder idly if the gods, too, suffer boredom, watching the endless repetitive pageantry conducted in their honor. Hours crawl by. The workers resume their tasks, hauling bricks up gently sloped ramps built from still more bricks. By now, the sheer number of bricks has become comically excessive. To construct a temple to appease a single god, humanity seems determined to use enough mud bricks to irritate an entire pantheon. Yet, from a purely historical perspective, which you note wryly is rarely pleasant, this colossal effort makes sense. The ziggurat is intended not only as a temple, but as a statement. We, mere humans, have gathered sufficient resources to construct this excessively tall pile of bricks. Clearly, we deserve your divine attention. You doubt, however, that divine attention is anything humans genuinely desire, especially given that historically, such attention rarely ends well. By evening, the ziggurat's base has grown sufficiently massive to suggest future grandeur. The workers, exhausted and despairing, look upon their creation not with pride, but with resignation, understanding that today's labor is merely the first in an endless sequence. They retreat to their shelters, leaving only priests behind to chant, presumably hoping to prevent the structure from collapsing overnight. A distinct possibility, given the slapdash nature of the building techniques. You remain as twilight descends, contemplating the human impulse to build vertically toward the heavens. Ziggurats, pyramids, temples, towers. Humans seem oddly convinced that height confers importance. Perhaps it is a way of distracting themselves from their inevitable insignificance. Or perhaps it is merely boredom. After all, you have learned from long experience that boredom can drive humanity to astonishing feats of pointless labor. Night settles gently, cloaking the half-built ziggurat in peaceful darkness. A faint breeze stirs, briefly dispersing the oppressive heat. Above, the stars blink with quiet detachment, indifferent to humanity's ceaseless striving. You smile wryly, imagining Nana, the moon god, glancing downward and sighing, resigned to another 1,000 years of mortals frantically trying to impress him. You consider whether the gods themselves might be exhausted by humanity's relentless, misguided devotion. Perhaps they too grow weary of having grand temples built in their honor, as if divine favor can be purchased with mud bricks and grain offerings. If so, you sympathize. Tomorrow, inevitably, the workers will return to continue their weary construction, building ever higher, each brick placed with a combination of resignation and hope. Ur's ziggurat will eventually rise as a testament both to human determination and folly, an excessively monumental building dedicated to thoroughly exhausted gods. And you, ever the patient observer, prepare yourself for yet another day of relentless sunshine, stubborn faith, and endless mud bricks. History's predictable, tedious, and comforting rhythm. Morning arrives like an unwelcome visitor, too bright and far too early, spilling sunlight onto Ur's dusty streets with its usual merciless enthusiasm. Today, however, your weary attention is captured not by temple priests chanting pointlessly at an indifferent sky, nor by stacks of mud bricks aspiring futilely toward heaven. Instead, you find yourself staring at something new, equally tedious, and just as absurd, an elaborate system of canals stretching out from the banks of the Euphrates like veins from an oversized and unhealthy heart. You sigh deeply as you watch dozens of laborers dig yet another trench, joining countless others crisscrossing the arid plain. The canals, like most human enterprises, promise much but deliver spectacularly little. They are supposed to bring prosperity, or at least water, into the heart of Ur. Instead, they mostly bring mud, mosquitoes, and endless disappointment. The foreman responsible for this hydraulic fiasco is a man named Enkimdu, an individual whose enthusiasm for irrigation surpasses even his ignorance of its limitations. He stands atop a heap of freshly excavated earth, waving dramatically at the workers below, shouting vague instructions about slope gradients and water flow, concepts you suspect he barely understands himself. You wonder absently if he imagines himself some master of nature, capable of directing rivers with little more than determination and an overabundance of optimism. Historically speaking, of course, this sort of hubris rarely ends well. Yet here the people of labor, driven by desperation rather than reason. It is remarkable, you reflect dryly, how readily humanity attempts to impose order upon nature. The Euphrates, sluggish and temperamental, appears less than cooperative, flowing lazily by, indifferent to the trenches gouged alongside it. The river, you suspect, knows precisely how futile this effort will turn out, and merely waits patiently to demonstrate the folly of human ambition. As the sun climbs higher, the worker's pace slows, bogged down by oppressive heat and increasing irritation. Mosquitoes swarm around them, drawn by stagnant pools forming at the canal bottoms, small ecosystems of mud, weeds, and disappointment. Laborers curse loudly, swatting ineffectually at their tormentors. Irrigation, it seems, involves a delicate balance between bringing life giving water to crops and providing perfect breeding grounds for insects that delight in spreading misery. Nearby, a cluster of priests gathers at the canal's edge, praying earnestly to Enki, the god of fresh water, and, presumably, disappointment. They chant solemn hymns, tossing handfuls of grain into the muddy water, grain that, once again, seems better suited for hungry workers than indifferent rivers. You find their devotion grimly amusing. If divine beings truly managed waterways, you doubt they'd require daily bribes of barley and wheat. Meanwhile, Enkidu continues issuing orders, utterly oblivious to the increasingly obvious flaws in his irrigation masterpiece. He commands workers to deepen trenches and redirect flows, hoping stubbornness alone might overcome physics and logic. Historically, optimism has never been a substitute for competent engineering, yet humans continue stubbornly to hope otherwise. By mid afternoon, the canal project hits its first predictable disaster. One poorly supported trench collapses spectacularly, sending muddy water cascading across the freshly tilled fields, obliterating a full day's labor. Workers stare at the destruction with expressions ranging from resignation to disgust. Enkidu, unfazed, declares loudly that setbacks are inevitable, conveniently ignoring the part played by his own questionable planning. He promptly orders the digging of yet another trench, one certain to meet the same inevitable fate. You watch with morbid fascination as this repetitive cycle unfolds. Canals are painstakingly excavated, partially filled with water, then promptly destroyed by the Euphrates' unpredictable surges. Each failure is met not with reassessment, but with stubborn determination to repeat precisely the same mistakes, only slightly more earnestly. You find yourself oddly comforted by humanity's relentless refusal to learn from experience. Such stubbornness might be considered admirable if it weren't so thoroughly exhausting. The workers finally pause to rest, retreating beneath flimsy shelters, muttering darkly about Enkidu, mosquitoes, and life in general. You overhear one laborer bitterly suggest that perhaps the gods themselves enjoy mocking human endeavors. Considering the results of today's work, you decide he's probably correct. Evening draws near, casting long shadows across the muddy, mosquito infested canals. From your vantage point, the network resembles a maze created by an especially sadistic deity, paths leading nowhere, trenches filled with stagnant water, and structures built purely to collapse. Yet, astonishingly, Ur's irrigation system will eventually become vital, though not without an absurdly high cost in human frustration and insect bites. Historically, irrigation made Ur a thriving trade center, allowing barley and wheat to flourish, fueling civilization's growth. Yet, gazing upon this disaster unfolding in slow motion, it's difficult to reconcile the promised prosperity with today's muddy catastrophe. Civilization, you conclude cynically, is largely a matter of persisting through repeated failure until something accidentally works. As twilight deepens, the priests depart, having exhausted their grain offerings and prayers. Enkidu, too, eventually retires, presumably to draft tomorrow's equally futile plans. Left alone, You gaze over the stagnant waters, reflecting on humanity's peculiar insistence that nature exists solely for human convenience. History repeatedly disproves this theory, yet humanity stubbornly refuses to acknowledge defeat. Nightfall finally arrives, bringing merciful relief from heat and mosquitoes. The Euphrates flows quietly beneath the starlit sky, indifferent to the mess created beside it. Humans imagine rivers exist to serve their needs. Rivers, of course, have no such delusions. You appreciate this indifferent wisdom of nature, calmly undermining every arrogant human endeavor. You sit quietly beside the failed canals, knowing tomorrow's dawn will bring yet another round of digging, shouting, and pointless prayer. Humans, you muse, never tire of repeating mistakes, determined that this time, surely, things will turn out differently. History, however, rarely rewards such optimism. You close your eyes briefly, listening to the quiet sound of flowing water. Perhaps this is history's secret, to keep attempting the impossible until accidental success arrives. It's a depressingly tedious process, yet one humanity eagerly embraces. Tomorrow's inevitable failures already await, yet you cannot help but feel strangely comforted by the predictability of human folly. Such is history, endless canals dug by exhausted workers, overseen by deluded optimists, perpetually flooded by indifferent rivers. You sigh softly, preparing yourself for another long day, watching humanity wrestle stubbornly, hopelessly, yet admirably against nature itself. You awake not to the now familiar drudgery of bricks and canals, but to a more vibrant, yet no less exhausting, spectacle, the heart of Ur's daily life, the market. You find yourself standing amidst the bustling, noisy chaos, surrounded by shouting vendors, haggling customers, dust swirling in the air, and the pervasive smell of livestock mingled generously with sweat. In short, a perfectly ordinary day in the supposedly civilized heart of ancient Mesopotamia. Around you spreads a vast square, crowded with stalls constructed from shaky reed mats, mud brick platforms, and tattered cloth canopies, none of which provides adequate shelter from the glaring sun. The market square, you note grimly, is less a monument to human commerce than to humanity's inexhaustible capacity for disorder. Yet, despite the mess, people swarm here eagerly, drawn like moths to a flame, albeit a particularly loud, dusty, and smelly flame. Vendors shout at passers-by with enthusiasm far exceeding the appeal of their products. One man aggressively promotes dried dates, shriveled beyond recognition, as though they were the secret to immortality itself. Another, apparently unconvinced by his own pitch, tries desperately to sell goat cheese that smells suspiciously older than the city walls. You observe a young woman bargaining furiously over barley prices with an elderly merchant, their voices steadily rising from polite negotiation into outright hostility. From your detached perspective, it seems a great deal of effort expended over very little. Yet, historically speaking, humans seem inclined to create conflict out of anything, especially when it involves money or grain. The atmosphere of the market, in short, is chaos incarnate, a blend of urgency, greed, stubbornness, and desperation, all coated generously with a layer of dust. Donkeys bray loudly, unhappy at having been forced into proximity with humans and their absurd commerce. Chickens flutter nervously in wicker cages, clearly suspicious of their owner's intentions. Children run wild between stalls, shouting joyfully, while tired mothers issue threats neither taken seriously nor enforced. In all of this, you see civilization clearly, the endless human drive toward advancement, punctuated continuously by childish squabbles, poor hygiene, and bad decisions. Yet, despite its obvious absurdities, the market holds a certain stubborn charm. Ur's marketplace is where trade converges from all corners of the known world, bringing grain from upriver, pottery from distant cities, woven cloth, precious stones, spices, and 1,000 other goods, none of which you particularly need or desire. This frantic exchange of commodities is precisely what has made Ur wealthy, despite its unimpressive canals, shaky ziggurats, and crumbling mud walls. Civilization, you muse dryly, may well be nothing more than organized chaos, a noisy illusion sustained purely by human stubbornness. In the market's heart, under a faded blue canopy, sits a corpulent merchant named Lugalon, whose expression perpetually alternates between smug superiority and wounded outrage. Today, Lugalon is locked in fierce debate with a potter, each accusing the other loudly of dishonesty, incompetence, and general moral deficiency. The argument concerns a shipment of cracked pottery, though you suspect both men secretly understand that all pottery in Ur is destined eventually to crack, making their argument largely pointless. Yet they persist anyway, faces flushed, hands gesticulating dramatically. Watching their escalating dispute, you reflect cynically that human civilization itself could easily be defined as endless arguments over fundamentally trivial matters. Yet, despite your quiet mockery, these disputes carry real stakes. Lugalon and the potter know their livelihoods depend upon their skill at negotiation and shouting matches. Commerce, you suppose, requires performance as much as genuine exchange of goods. Thus, Ur's market functions as much theater as economic hub, a noisy stage where humanity performs daily its oldest drama, the struggle for advantage. Nearby, a scribe sits hunched beneath a modest canopy, offering his services to merchants too busy or too illiterate to maintain their own records. You pause briefly, observing him carefully imprint cuneiform symbols into clay tablets, records of transactions that will later become evidence of precisely the sorts of arguments Lugalin enjoys so much. Ur's scribes keep meticulous track of debts, taxes, and commercial disputes, though their accuracy rarely prevents conflict. Human beings, it seems, prefer arguing passionately over vaguely remembered details than calmly accepting precise records. Civilization thus marches forward, propelled as much by stubborn refusal to admit defeat as by genuine progress. Afternoon drives onward, with sunlight intensifying both heat and tempers. Arguments multiply, growing louder as fatigue sets in. You overhear two women quarreling fiercely over the freshness of fish, each accusing the other of deliberate deception. Fish, you think grimly, rarely inspire trust, yet humanity persists in eating them, suspicious and resentful all the while. A nearby merchant, tired and clearly indifferent, sells pottery with enthusiasm long since depleted by repetition, promising each customer that his wares will outlast their grandchildren, a claim obviously false, yet universally accepted. Despite the chaos, a strange, reassuring rhythm underlies everything. Human societies function precisely because they tolerate a certain level of noise, disorder, and unresolved tension. You watch as an exhausted young man, clearly bewildered by his surroundings, attempts to sell his father's wheat harvest. The transaction concludes only after extensive haggling, mutual threats, and dramatic gestures of despair. Yet, when finished, both seller and buyer walk away smiling, each convinced of having outsmarted the other. You consider this carefully. Perhaps humanity thrives precisely because everyone imagines themselves uniquely clever, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. As the sun finally sinks lower, casting long shadows across the market, vendors begin packing up their wares, their voices softer, but still argumentative. Lugalin, at last exhausted by pointless negotiations, grudgingly accepts his cracked pottery. The young scribe carefully stacks his tablets, containing tomorrow's inevitable disputes. The animals settle into resigned quiet, relieved their ordeal has ended. For today, you linger in the fading light, contemplating humanity's relentless pursuit of commerce. The market, noisy, dirty, chaotic, is perhaps civilization's truest symbol, a constant struggle for tiny gains amidst endless frustration. Yet, paradoxically, it somehow works. Flourishes precisely because humans insist upon arguing endlessly about trivialities, trading passionately for what are essentially fleeting commodities. Night settles gently over the now empty square. Dust settles, silence returns, and for a brief moment, the market seems peaceful until tomorrow, when the arguments inevitably resume. You smile wryly, comforted by the certainty that human civilization, with all its dirt, noise, and absurdity, will stubbornly persist. Civilization's chaotic dance continues, exhausting yet oddly reassuring. You prepare yourself calmly for another day, another round of loud voices, trivial disputes, and endless commerce. Such is humanity's fate, arguing forever in markets built from dirt, noise, stubbornness, and hope. You stand quietly at the edge of gazing toward the distant horizon as the once great city slowly begins its inevitable descent toward oblivion. What was once vibrant, noisy, and seemingly eternal has started to crumble, returning inexorably to the dust from which it arose. Ur, the jewel of Sumerian civilization, has reached the height of its power only to find itself standing upon the precipice of decay. From your viewpoint, history feels both merciless and predictable. Humans build, flourish briefly, then collapse spectacularly. usually due to a combination of arrogance, greed, environmental destruction, or simple exhaustion. Ur is no exception. The signs are subtle yet unmistakable: cracked walls, abandoned buildings, farms slowly surrendering to encroaching desert. Most notably, you see the canals, those optimistic hydraulic failures, which now lie clogged with mud and despair, neglected as the people of Ur slowly retreat into fatalistic acceptance. Walking through streets that once echoed with life, you note the quiet sense of abandonment permeating the city. Gone are the bustling markets filled with noisy traders arguing endlessly over trivialities. Merchants now sit quietly, their eyes dull, their wares dusty and unsold. Lugalin, once Ur's proudest merchant, sits gloomily at his stall, indifferent to passers-by. Trade routes have dried up, disrupted by constant warfare, declining harvests, and growing poverty. Civilization's glittering facade is cracking, revealing beneath it a fragile and exhausted humanity. Even the ziggurat, Ur's proudest achievement and greatest folly, stands grimly silhouetted against the sky, partially collapsed and overgrown with weeds. Priests still ascend occasionally to chant lifeless prayers, though their efforts now seem futile even to themselves. You suspect Nana, the moon god, grew weary of humanity's relentless petitions long ago. Gods, like humans, tire of repetition. You pause briefly near the base of the crumbling ziggurat, considering humanity's endless quest for permanence. History repeatedly proves civilization's vanity. Humans build toward the heavens only to discover that even the grandest structures eventually succumb to gravity, neglect, and time. The ziggurat, like the city around it, was always destined to crumble, yet humans persist in imagining otherwise. Around you, ordinary citizens wander the streets listlessly, visibly burdened by hopelessness. Farmers who once dug canals now merely watch helplessly as salt poisons their fields, rendering them barren. Historically, civilizations often destroy themselves not through dramatic catastrophe, but through slow accumulation of minor failures. Irrigation canals filled with silt, crops failed, fields abandoned, small tragedies compounding quietly into inevitable collapse. You overhear whispered conversations filled with bitterness, blame, and regret. People speak quietly of neighboring tribes raiding towns, of endless taxes demanded by rulers growing increasingly indifferent to suffering. Politicians, kings, and priests squabble endlessly over power, each group blaming the others for the city's decline while offering no solutions. Historically, humans excel at assigning blame precisely when solutions become impossible. As evening approaches, the air fills with uneasy quiet. Families retreat indoors, barricading doors against imaginary threats as paranoia slowly infects the city's soul. Historically, fear signals civilization's final stage. As trust erodes, communities dissolve, and hope disappears. Ur's population shrinks steadily, residents drifting away to other cities, or simply giving up, resigned to fate. At sunset, You find yourself at Ur's once lively gates, now poorly maintained and barely guarded. Soldiers sit listlessly, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They know enemies surround Ur, hostile neighbors sensing weakness, waiting patiently for collapse. Historically, civilizations weaken from within long before external enemies arrive. You recall vividly the optimism with which these walls were first built, how certain the Sumerians were that mud bricks and determination could protect them forever. History, unfortunately, offers few guarantees. Nightfall brings a quiet despair, broken only occasionally by distant cries of anguish, fear, or resignation. It's difficult to determine. Ur's grandeur fades quietly, unnoticed by the outside world. Historically, civilization ends not dramatically, but gradually, slowly suffocated by neglect, despair, and failure of collective will. Humans rarely acknowledge collapse until long after it becomes irreversible. You linger beside a dusty road, watching a family quietly packing belongings onto a cart, preparing to leave the city forever. The father's face is weary, resigned. The mother whispers comfort to crying children. They leave behind everything they've known, seeking hope elsewhere. History is littered with similar quiet departures, families fleeing failed civilizations, stubbornly believing something better lies ahead. The moon rises slowly, indifferent as ever to human suffering. Beneath its pale gaze, Ur's streets remain dark and silent. Occasionally, you glimpse faint lights inside dwellings, tiny, stubborn sparks representing families still clinging desperately to hope. History, after all, is also defined by humanity's refusal to surrender entirely, even amidst certain defeat. Walking slowly toward Ur's outskirts, you pause one last time to gaze upon this fading city. The dusty plain surrounding Ur stretches toward infinity, silently reclaiming human ambitions, swallowing canals, walls, ziggurats, everything humanity has built. History, you conclude grimly, resembles an endlessly repeating cycle: build, thrive briefly, collapse dramatically, then start again somewhere else, forever imagining permanence possible. Yet, despite the gloom, you sense quiet dignity in Ur's inevitable demise. Civilization's failure carries tragic beauty precisely because humans insistently hope against reason. They build cities in deserts, irrigate hostile landscapes, erect temples to indifferent gods, always driven by dreams exceeding reality's limitations. Tomorrow, Ur will awaken again, diminished yet stubbornly persistent. Humans will continue hoping, arguing, building, even as a collapse looms inevitably ahead. History offers little comfort except this: humanity never entirely abandons hope, even amidst despair. You step finally beyond Ur's crumbling walls, feeling strangely at peace. Ur's splendor will vanish entirely someday, buried beneath desert sands. Yet humanity endures stubbornly, rising repeatedly from failures, driven by dreams forever exceeding practicality. History's eternal cycle continues. Behind you, Ur fades slowly into darkness, silent testament to civilization's fleeting glory. Ahead, beneath moonlight, stretches endless possibility. Tomorrow brings another civilization, equally hopeful, equally doomed, yet equally determined to flourish despite inevitability. Such is humanity's enduring paradox, forever doomed to fail, forever refusing surrender. You smile gently, comforted by history's reassuring rhythm, as night swallows entirely, leaving only memory, brief splendor fading inevitably into dust.